get started here, welcome to this afternoon's Planning Commission meeting. Before we get started with our first presentation on the text amendment, just any conflicts of interest or potential conflicts from the commissioners today? Okay, then we'll have staff present initially, and then we'll have our applicant present.
Thank you, commissioners. So the first case is a zoning text amendment that would affect the downtown height overlay as well as the transitional city center, which is Article 6, and the Grand River overlay. Excuse me. So we've actually, me and myself and DGRI have had several conversations about this very subject for the past few years. When we updated the amendment, these sections in 2015, it was based on the feedback at that time and trying to achieve the goals that were set forth in the GR Forward plan. However, what we've seen is, different market conditions, different housing demands. We've quantified the housing need within the city. And so there have been a lot of changing factors that made us rethink whether or not our current height limits and the bonus structure that was embedded within the overlay and the Grand River, the height overlay for downtown and the Grand River overlay was really working the way we wanted it to work. And so there was a collective agreement that we probably need to relook at this. We have a critical need for housing. We have a desire for increased investment in our downtown. We've got the infrastructure in place to support it. And unfortunately, nothing is ever as easy as you hope it would be. And it's actually a fairly complicated process, especially when we are talking about the Grand River overlay, because we really do want to make sure we maintain the ability to incentivize access to and along the river, which of course is one of one of the key goals of the city is to activate the riverfront, and that was supported through the O2 master plan, Green Grand Rapids. We've got a lot of studies that you're aware of that support that stated goal. So the only way for us to achieve that access is by incentivizing it. So with that element, it was actually a far more complicated amendment than I had the bandwidth to do. But through conversations with the development community, there was a development group that had a desire to build taller, and I indicated that, yes, I'm generally supportive of that, but it's currently not permitted, but we would like to see the same thing. I just don't have the bandwidth to do it right now. And so I think, fortunately, the planning department has built some pretty successful relationships with the development community and the community at large. And so they were able to say, well, you know what, can we help you? Can we partner with you and help you provide you with that capacity for the city, the Planning Commission, the City Commission to consider this. And so I said, well, sure. And so this was really a partnership with Progressive Engineering. Suzanne, of course, was hired to help me create an amendment for consideration. We also met with a couple of local architects who I think I can say are generally supportive of this as well. And also with Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc. I provided a letter. The chamber provided a letter as well. So there seems to be some pretty good support for us to evaluate this amendment. And so that's sort of how we got here today with having an application that is not brought forward by the Planning Department, but certainly was done in collaboration with and supported by the Planning Department. So with that, I'll turn it over to Suzanne, and she can come through, walk through the amendments. She has a presentation for us, and then we can engage in a discussion. This is a public hearing that we'll hold today, and if you feel ready and all your questions are answered, we'd be looking for a recommendation to take this forward to City Commission. Thank you. Is your mic on?
Now it is.
Now is it on?
Yes.
Yes. thought I could just project. Labor, lumber, land, and lending have all affected the ability of projects to kick off and to start to go. Certainly, there's some uncertainty right now about the economy, but also the debate, what I thought was really interesting, was this go up or go out, meaning that in the conversations with the developer, he said, well, I'll have to acquire this additional piece of property to get the number of units I need to make this performa work. So it's, do they acquire additional property because they're capped by the height, or do you allow a little bit more height so that they don't have to do that? So that's this dynamic of, there's a certain number of units that seem to be magical in the development community that work, and some are saying that they have to do additional property acquisition to make that happen without the additional height where it's not present. Kristen mentioned the current bonus program has not been used. There's been little pieces that were used, or little things that happened, for example, along Canal Park. There was the 5-story housing development where Linear is, but a lot of the step backs and pushes and how that happened was really complicated and a challenge to work through. Otherwise, we haven't seen any use of the program at all since it was created. And then, as was mentioned, the access to and along the river. Just to give you some background on the zone districts that we're talking about, because usually you don't have to encounter the height overlays as a normal course of action for downtown. So the City Center Zone District has 3 zone districts, sub-zone districts, and an overlay for height. DH1 is the center of the city, and there is no max height in that zone district. There's no cap on that. So there is a minimum, but DH1 is just allows whatever height. So that's not what we're talking about today. DH2A is in North Monroe, south of Fulton, and DH2B is the near west side. There's also parts of DH2A on the near west side too, which I'll show you in a minute. Then you have the transitional city center, which is really the donut around downtown, if you think of it that way. Really, originally when it was built, that this transition meant 2 things. One was this transition from industrial use to mixed use, if you think about it like that. 40% of the land that was zoned industrial in 1969 was changed to mixed use in 2007. So there was a huge transition in what happened along the river, and really that's these old factory buildings that we're talking about. And then also transitional from downtown to the neighborhoods, right? So kind of you think about kind of this cross-section of development in the city. So it's kind of those 2 pieces. When we use the word transitional city center, kind of that was the meaning of it. And then you have the Grand River overlay, and certainly along the river, right? So, and you do have some of these height pieces that come into play, which currently the height requirements are what in those zone districts are kind of the determining factor for building height, and we're proposing a change there just to provide some clarity. So this map gives you some idea on where these are. So as I mentioned, DH1 is that brighter pink center city area. DH2 is around it, the perimeter, and then the yellow is TCC, that transitional center further over. The blue and green areas, because yellow and blue make green, are along basically the northern portion. Most of the Riverwalk is already in place, or all of it's in place in the DH1, and there's action being taken right now down to Wealthy to connect that in. So there's no river overlay really that applies to those properties in DH1 because it's already built out and it already exists. What the request is to take the DH2A zone districts or overlay, that lighter pink area, and go from 10 stories by right, which is by right. You currently allow 16 stories with the bonuses. So you already allow up to 16, and so the request is for 20. And again, that's partly, actually what was interesting is when the Residence Inn went in, the Flatiron building across from Sanchez, the developers were talking about how quantities of 10 seem to work well from an elevator standpoint. And so we said, well, if we're already at 16, go to 20. So that's where the 20 came from. So really right now it's 16 with bonuses, requesting 20 by right. In the DH2, which is the area in that peachy color along near the west side. And to clarify where that red line is, that is to the east of the railroad tracks along Seward Avenue. And so the request there is to allow, to change it from 12 stories with bonuses to 10 stories. It's kind of a middle ground between the 7 and 12 that's currently there by right and with bonuses. So 10 seem to be kind of the next step down, understanding that there's a sensitivity there with the near west side. There has been for a very long time about how much downtown encroaches into the area. And so it was kind of, that was perceived as possibly an alternative, so not quite as high, but close. The TCC currently you allow 5 stories with bonuses, and it's just to request 5 stories by right. So as we're working through that, it basically, the reason why we got into those other zone districts was because all the bonus tables are tied to those right now, and so it was, Kristen mentioned the complicated nature of trying to unwind some of this and pull it out. So that's why those zone districts were included. When we did that, the Grand River overlay, because it was, the current zoning is tied to the underlying zoning, we still needed a bonus structure to be able to incentivize river access to and along the river. So because of Supreme Court decisions, we can't require that. If they're using economic development incentives, the City Commission could do that. But in zoning, it's much easier because you're already going through site plan review, you already are tracking that. If it was approved through economic development in the incentive program, it could be missed because economic development doesn't review the plans that come in for development. So, so that was the logic in looking at then, all right, how do we take those bonuses and incorporate them in a different way for the Grand River overlay? So just to give you an idea of what those bonuses are currently, with the existing column, and then you've got proposed. Currently in DH2A and 2B, you're looking at mixed income housing, green elements, and public art. And in TCC, it also includes transit and urban open space. One thing of note with the mixed income housing, and this was changed a while ago, where 2 different housing incentives or housing bonuses were provided in the zoning ordinance. Kristen had worked with ICCF and other nonprofits, and what we found was that really developers do best if they swim in their lanes, and trying to require mixed income in one structure gets really complicated quickly. Even, for example, if you're doing LIHTC on one part, it has to be completely condoed and separated from the rest of the building if you're doing market rate in another portion. Most developers specialize in one or the other, so it does get really complicated trying to do mixed income housing, and it has not worked very well. The incentives built into the zoning in other locations were done, some were tailored for affordable housing providers, and others were tailored for market rate providers because of that. So that's one reason the mixed income one has not taken off and worked very well. The Grand River overlay bonuses then, this is the only zone district then for this portion that we're talking about, keeping bonuses included. And so they would really only be tied to public access to and along the river. And that's because the other ones, a lot of the development along the river with the Grand River Greenway monies that have come in to develop the trails all along there and the amenities, it's really not needed. It'll be planned and developed by others. And in this case, just making sure we have access is the biggest carrot we have. So it's kind of using the carrot and stick. The stick is we're capping the amount of height you can build by right in this zone district. The carrot is you give us public access and you can go up to the same height as in those other zone districts. The one nuance to this then, so we have the kind of the carrot for public access along the river is in the GRO is height. We also have step backs included in that zone language, and we did some case study research trying to figure out. We were initially looking for everything and looking at step backs because we know there's been some concern about buildings that we call it fill the bathtub, right, from the maximum height, maximum setback, and they're big square boxes. And so there was some concern expressed about, well, is that what we're going to get? Even if we increase this height, how do we think about more sensitive development that could maybe transition a little bit better or have some variation in it? And so we looked at some examples and really landed on the San Marcos example that we thought was really good. And what they do is they take a percentage of the frontage and they allow it, there's a 40% and a 30% depending on the depth of the step back. But they allow some different configurations. It's just based off that percentage to do a step back. And so it could be the front, the middle, it could be along the sides, it could be along the back. It's common right now if you see a lot of buildings being built with parking incorporated into the building because the ideal depth for a parking ramp is 120 feet. Ideal depth for a residential part is 90 feet. So you'll see some of this naturally happening already, but they codified it. To make sure that we could also incentivize that access to the river from the public right-of-way, we did incorporate step-back language that it had to be on all four sides of a building, just in the overlay zone district. You would get the overlay, in the overlay district, you would get the step-back eliminated by providing that public access along it, but we're still requiring we're still requiring the step-back along the front of the building, the fronts of the building. So the river side's considered a front and the street side's considered a front. So in this case, we would still have a step back for only those river properties, partly because of sunlight, views, trying to soften that edge because it's just such a narrow wedge in a lot of cases to make that happen. We are not proposing step backs in the other zone districts. So, and that's pretty much the summary. I don't think there's anything else. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Suzanne. Any questions? Did you have more you wanted to add?
I just wanted to make sure it was clear. I mentioned this during lunch meeting, but we are not proposing any changes to the boundaries of the respective districts. So we're not expanding the downtown. We're not changing the map. So this is simply working within the established boundaries already, just in case that wasn't clear.
So we're trying to develop walkable density, right? So do you think that the 60% ground floor non-residential is still appropriate?
Are you suggesting it should be higher? Or
We know retail is changing, we know, but today, with considering all things, do you believe that's still the best way to go?
Well, I have to check with Chris. I think there's only some streets in downtown where the retail requirement exists. There's an overlay for that, or they're identified in the zoning ordinance for specific streets. The rest of downtown does not have to provide retail on the ground floor. There is still the transparency requirement, but it does not have to be retail for all of those streets.
And that 60% transparency does not apply to residential structures. That's just for the commercial.
Okay, thank you. So that therein is my question, right? I just want to make sure that we're doing enough. That's going to be an edge, right, to the rest of the city. And of course, we're looking at increasing the possibility for density, which is all good. But we also don't want to increase density without providing all of the things that people who might live there might want access to. So of course that speaks to the public access, but also to the non-residential uses.
I think where it probably comes into play the most in some of these is that, for example, if they're building a parking ramp, they still have to have an active use on the ground floor. So I think you are going to see some hybrids where you might have a standalone apartment building and next to it they're providing parking, but because it's an easier dimension to do outside of the building, but that because of the way that the parking ramp language is, they would have to provide an active edge to that. So I think you're probably going to get some hybrid versions of that where you would still get those pieces. 601 Bond is an example of that, I think, where they added retail below and then they have their parking. So you wouldn't put residential below the parking. And most developments now are incorporating parking into their buildings. So I think you're still going to see those active edges being created with the retail going in the bottom, parking sandwiches, retail, parking, and residential above.
Yeah, and I think what we're not changing are elements of the ordinance that I think are already working that you were speaking to is, you can't put a parking structure on a primary street face without planning commission approval. And I think you'd be hard pressed to arrive at a reason for that approval. So there's a 75-25% mix where 75% of the linear frontage of the building has to be an active use. Whether it's residential or office or commercial is sort of dependent on its physical location in the downtown. And then 25% of that facade can be the parking deck, and that's really primarily for the access to the ramp that then either tends to go behind the liner, the frontage, the active uses, or it's to go up and become the sandwich.
There are no other questions? Maybe.
The yellow, as you're going further up Monroe, it's permitted 5 stories. Do you ever see that, you and Kristen, see that developing more into high-rise, or is that just as we get further north, we're going to step down? I'm just thinking about incentives of seeing some of the factories that are there now being torn down and possibly rebuilt. And
I think most of that conversation is a better master plan conversation. I don't want to say never, no, absolutely not, because I think that the needs and the vision of the community evolve, they change over time. But that to me is a larger community conversation that I'm not willing to take on right now. I think that there might be pieces of this, the yellow, the current transitional city center that might be ripe. I mentioned between 6th Street and Leonard, where you can see, this map doesn't show it, it's still within the DDA boundaries, but it's transitional city center, and there might be opportunities there to expand the city center zone district. I wanted to take that separately when we're talking about map changes or boundary changes. I think that those are different conversations that it's important to involve stakeholders.
I think you're right. Thank you. That's a good point. And yeah, we have time on that. I'm visioning out 20 years, but
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, with that,
It might be a good time to just go on the record and talk about why this isn't part of the master plan discussion.
sure.
I think for the public.
Yep, absolutely. So, as you know, we are about a third of the way through a current master planning process. And I think that there could be a natural tendency to say, let's fold this in. But at the time, we still have a year left of process. We still have another, probably at least a year before the implementation of that plan. And so, yet we have current challenges that I think were on Suzanne's first slide with construction costs and a critical need for housing and density. We have stated goals within our current plans that would suggest we're okay with building bigger downtown. So I think we currently have master planning support. Well, I know we do. We have master planning support for this. We approached it differently back in 2015, and we learned from that, and we realized maybe it didn't work the way we anticipated, and a lot has changed since 2015. And I also think that, for me, this is sort of a low-hanging fruit, because we've had similar conversations over the last decade about what heights should be downtown, and I think that there's just a natural way to look at this outside of a traditional master planning process for us. So I was comfortable allowing, or, not allowing, but taking this forward and supporting it without being involved in a larger process. I can say that that's not the case for other conversations we've had about changes to zoning structure. One of the ones was, how big do we go with the city center? And I was like, let's just hold off before we start making too many significant changes through, this feels like a very tailored situation, and easily I can reconcile it.
All right, thanks for that discussion. I'll open up the public hearing, so if you're here today about this proposed text amendment, please come forward and state your name and share your brief thoughts with us. Okay, I'll close the public hearing.
I will note in your packet, you have letters of support from the Chamber and from Downtown Grand Rapids, Inc. And I verbally, Mr. Johnny Brand told me that a letter was coming. I don't believe we received it from the West Side Corridor Improvement Authority, was also in support of this, but we did not receive the letter, so maybe we'll receive that before City Commission.
All right, any further discussion or questions from either Suzanne or Kristen? Okay. Piece of cake.
Yeah, no, I think this makes sense. I appreciate kind of the nuance of the situation and the mixing of districts and overlays, and appreciate how it's been broken down, and I think it's a reasonable and sensible and needed amendment. So I'm in full support.
I'm in support as well, and I appreciate the fact that, of course, this is a learning process by which we're looking at what works, what didn't, what needs to be updated, and listening to developers and architects. So I feel comfortable that we've looked at and learned and improved.
Yeah, I also want to say, so in terms of the step back stuff only being applied in the river, I appreciate that that wouldn't necessarily have the effect that we'd want in the outside of that overlay area, and I'm happy that we have other ordinance language in place to make sure building materials and architecture, all of that stuff that makes buildings, the built environment pedestrian friendly, that exists, and that helps the development in those areas outside the overlay district.
I had to step out for a minute. So Suzanne, did you mention about the step backs for the access to, you did mention, so there might be a condition, if you were inclined to approve it, that there might be a condition to update the language to reflect that where accesses to the river walk is already provided, that those step backs, that intent has been met and we wouldn't require step backs. Was that covered?
No, I did mention that.
You didn't? Oh, I'm sorry. You were supposed to, but I just did. So as Suzanne mentioned, Suzanne mentioned the intent of the step backs would be, I lost my train of thought.
The side step backs, the intent was to be the stick to try to get the access from a public right-of-way to the river edge. But where there's already access existing, then that shouldn't apply, because the goal is really to get the access. So we do have to do a little bit of word tweaking in there about, it says street and it should say public right-of-way, just to be clear.
So when you think about a corner property, for example, I just on my map quickly pulled up 6th Street in front. Coming from access to a river walk is already provided from 6th Street. And so it's really probably unnecessary for us to require a second access to the river along that property. And yet in that situation, without a tweak to the language of the ordinance, they would be required to provide side step backs. And so what I'm suggesting, or I think Suzanne and I talked earlier, what we're suggesting is if the Planning Commission's comfortable saying where that access to the riverfront is already provided, that intent has already been met, in which case those side step backs would not, the building's expanding with my hands, those side step backs wouldn't be required. So the intent remains intact. It's just a little bit of a tweak to the language to recognize that.
But if they're building a new building on the property, it doesn't just presume that the access will remain from both sides, right? If they're going to, even if it's a corner lot that currently has access from the corner, but if they were to replace this building, build it taller, that doesn't mean that this would remain, would it? Because
Well, you're right. That would only be if they continued the easement or gave us an easement, you're right, there would have to be a continuation of that riverfront in order for that to be eligible.
so if they continued that access, then they don't have to do the side step back.
Correct.
And they don't have to provide a different point of access. But that's and that only works then on a corner property?
I'm hard pressed to think of another scenario unless maybe there's an easement already in place, so it's already there. And we require those easements before we issue the permits. So we would have to have the documentation in hand to say, we've got the easements to and along the river, and in some cases, the to the river walk is from a public right-of-way, and the example I've got in front of me is 6th Street. In those cases, that building permit could be reviewed without having or requiring those side step backs.
Okay,
You seem unsure.
I guess it makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, now I'm feeling confused myself. But the step backs would remain required along the frontages of the
Yes.
building, the river and the street.
Yes.
Okay. Fine.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
Okay.
I'm happy to make a motion unless you want more discussion or there's more to say. Okay. Now therefore be it resolved that the Planning Commission recommends that the City Commission approve the proposed text amendments to the zoning ordinance for the following reasons. It is, that's all right. At least I don't have to read the normal conditions at A. The proposed amendments are consistent with the purpose and intent of the master plan and zoning ordinance because the amendments support multiple goals of the 2002 Grand Rapids Master Plan, including promoting the expansion of the resident population in and adjacent to downtown by encouraging the conversion of near downtown and riverfront industrial and commercial areas to mixed use, capturing the benefits of improved riverfront visibility and access by encouraging mixed-use development in near downtown industrial areas east of US 131 and west of Monroe Avenue, and extending the Riverwalk system from Riverside Park to Millennium Park, including a Riverwalk connection on the east bank of the Grand River located west of Market Street in the area south of downtown. The amendments support the goals of the GR Forward Downtown and River Action Plan to enhance neighborhood access to the river, to leverage development opportunities, to hit critical mass, and to preserve and expand housing opportunities. The amendments support the purpose and intent of the CC Zone District to provide an intense development pattern that encourages vitality through compact development and the creation of a pedestrian-friendly and transit-friendly environment. The amendments support the purpose and intent of the TNTCC Zone District to be a transitional commercial buffer surrounding downtown that allows for more density than would be found in neighborhood commercial districts. The proposed amendments will enhance the functionality or character of the future development in the city because the proposed text amendments will allow for needed density in the city's downtown while requiring thoughtful design that protects access to sunlight and views and encourages design that acknowledges the pedestrian experience of the city. The amendments in the Grand River overlay will add stronger incentives to developers to allow public access to and along the Grand River. The physical, geological, hydrological, and other environmental features of the property to be rezoned are compatible with the full range of uses in the proposed zone district because the proposed amendments encourage compact development, which takes up less land and resources, and public access to the river is also encouraged, which will enhance the ability for residents and visitors to experience the defining natural feature of downtown, the Grand River. The proposed amendments will protect the health, safety, and general welfare of the public because access to the Grand River promotes health through access to nature and providing opportunities for exercise and recreation. The general welfare of the public will be improved by these amendments through prioritizing public access to and along the river. Allowing for added density in select districts will encourage the vibrancy of the downtown through adding residents to frequent businesses and add foot traffic. And more residents downtown could mean more use of public transit and fewer trips by the personal automobile, helping to mitigate carbon emissions and their deleterious impacts to human health. Testing my reading skills here. The proposed amendments are needed to correct an error or omission in the original. I don't know. I'm not going to do that one. The proposed amendments will address a community need in physical or economic conditions or development practices because these amendments will help to incentivize the provision of public access to the river, and the height amendments will work to address the need for the 14,106 housing units Grand Rapids is projected to need over the next 5 years. And the proposed amendments would not result in the creation of significant nonconformities in the city because the proposed additional height is already permitted with bonuses, and thus significant nonconformities are not expected. And is there a condition?
I'm looking at Mike Hooker to see if he's read it. That this recommendation includes a change to the proposed amendments to eliminate the requirement of side step backs where access to a river walk with public access already exists.
Yes, I would like to incorporate that into my motion.
Support.
All right, we have a motion and support. Any discussion? All right, if no other discussion, all those in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, motion passes. Thank you. Thanks. Next on the agenda is a discussion about billboards. I don't know, are you leading this one?
Yeah, I'll tee it up. Same show, introduction by me, and then Suzanne will provide us with more detail. Similar situation in that there has been a recognized need to evaluate the current billboard exchange program within the zoning ordinance through various conversations with the billboard company and different application requests. We started to understand that the existing billboard exchange program may have accomplished everything we could hope that it would accomplish, maybe outlived its useful life, in that we haven't seen utilization of the exchange program in many years, and yet we still have billboards that are in the way of good redevelopment projects for the city. So it's been a challenge. You've seen creative uses of existing tools like the optional plan review or the plan sign program, pardon me. I'm thinking the Harrison Park development over on Alpine, where we use the plan sign program to allow for the relocation of an existing billboard to the side of the building. And so that really was a square peg, round hole situation and probably not the most appropriate tool. So what would be appropriate is for us to update the exchange program. This strategy that has been developed is a pretty significant shift, and that's why I asked that it come forward as a discussion item before we're asking you to vote on it, because I want to make sure that we understand the nuances, that we have an opportunity to hear your feedback and any potential changes to that before you make a recommendation to City Commission. But in short, the strategy is changing from, trying to incentivize the removal of billboards to sort of an acknowledgement or an acceptance that we've probably seen a reduction to the extent possible. The billboard company has a business to run, of course. They have goals themselves, to a relocation strategy, so allowing for the billboards to be relocated within the same zone district, and perhaps it goes from a pole-mounted billboard to being mounted on the side of the building, and allows for that negotiation, if you will, between the billboard company and the property owner. So this gives us a little bit more flexibility in how billboards can exist in the city. There's also I can't remember the name of it, I think it was supersized billboards that we could also allow, and that's really similar, not dissimilar, to billboards or signs that you see on the side of the buildings in major urban centers that are significantly bigger than the billboard sizes we see here in Grand Rapids. And then the last strategy shift would be to consider allowing electronic billboards to exist along the highway within the city. All of that still would happen with incentivize or through a credit system. So they bank credits for removal or have credits from removal, and have to utilize those credits to either relocate or supersize it or to upgrade to a digital. And so the strategy is different. Suzanne will go into more detail, and we look forward to your feedback and any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Kristen. And I'm not working for the billboard company. I'll just say that. Been working with them, but not for them. So I've been representing development interests. So this is to help facilitate development. You have seen examples for Indigo Development, for example, has been trying to develop on Wealthy. ICCF had tried to do it before across from Mary Free Bed. There's been a billboard that's standing there. Lease is finally coming due to be able to allow development. But you've got cases like that all over the city. Copper Rock has, over by the Click, there is a billboard that is a development challenge. So it's kind of all over, and I'll show you why in a second. But so right now we currently have about 200 billboard structures, almost 300 billboard faces in the city, and part of this program does reduce billboards. It continues to reduce billboards, but it also is trying to balance that with the industry itself. They'll say that, you don't make bank branches close when you want a bank to move or whatever. And in this case, for the billboard company, this is their revenue. This is what they do, their storefront, if you so to speak, and that provides advertising for local businesses and others. So they, wanted to say, they have economic value and to acknowledge that. And that was really the premise for the original billboard program. Billboard Exchange program was recognizing that there is value in those boards, but the city doesn't want to have to buy them to get rid of them, or a developer to pay a lot of money to buy out a lease. So we recognize there is a value to them, but how do you value those and give other things in exchange for billboard removal? And historically that's been, they could go 5 feet taller, they could go from a sign that's back to back to a V, they could replace the structure. So a while back, you might have seen like the old I-beam billboard structures along the highway were replaced with newer structures that were one monopole, so it looked cleaner, better representation in the city. So there was value to them in being able to upgrade those signs, which is why they voluntarily removed almost 50 billboard structures when the Billboard Exchange program first was enacted. And most importantly, right now they're an encumbrance to development. It took quite a while for the billboards to be addressed up in the Creston neighborhood. There was 2 sites where the bowling alley was and across from the brewery, and billboard structures there, and trying to get them removed, and time is money. And it takes time to negotiate where that goes, trying to figure out with the city where we place these, if we're allowed on the building or not. So there's some delay and ambiguity in that development never likes. If we can make it as clean and clear as possible, it's much better. So really thinking about the neighborhoods, especially where we've had a lot of conflicts, and how we can facilitate kind of some more flexibility in how things are done. So there's two ways we're going to do that Kristen described, but I'll go into more detail. Here's the data for the Billboard Exchange Program. So you can see after it was enacted in 2010, huge spike in number of structures and faces that were removed. So out of 200, we lost 25, so more than 10%. Were removed for the billboard structures. And a structure might have 1 or 2 faces on it, so you had almost 50 faces, but you have some that were only one-sided that were removed. So we were able to put a pretty significant dent in that without any cost to the city, and it also allowed for those parcels to be able to be developed. So pretty successful. This pie chart, I think, is a good representation of why we have an issue. So the light blue color is the TBA zone district. So in the TBA, that's where we have a lot of those, they're the neighborhood commercial districts. That's where a lot of signs went. Industrial is that kind of brownish, lightish brownish color, and that's where we do allow billboards in. So that's more appropriate. Obviously, the little slices are more the residential zone districts, and then you kind of have an equal share with TCC and the downtown being the navy blue and the other brown color. So kind of proportionately, if you especially look at TCC, that's where it's most greatly affected. And you can see how we were able to move the needle from 2009 to 2021 to be able to facilitate more development in the TBA districts. Just kind of the statistics by artery. So this gives you an idea of where they're mostly located. Certainly along 131 and 196. 28th Street has quite a collection as well. But then you've got Plainfield, Leonard, Burton, Wealthy, Division, Alpine, and Eastern, where you see other billboard faces. So if you think of any of those streets and you think about the development that's been occurring along those corridors, you can start to see why we have an issue. And so really trying to figure out where we put these. Kristen mentioned the Harrison Park development. You can see next to the house on the side of the building, they relocated the billboard to that structure. The Quimby site I mentioned, where the billboard's been in the way and they had to negotiate how to move it out. So we've got examples like that throughout the city. So in 2021, Kristen had a recommendation to look at incentivizing additional billboard removal and along the highway. When we initially looked particularly at digital in 2009, there were a couple impediments to digital that we decided not to take it on at that moment. One was that there was still, it wasn't clear kind of whether digital billboards were good or bad along the highway, like how much of a nuisance they could be. The technology was new. And we've kind of taken a conservative approach that if you don't have to do it right away, it's okay to wait a little bit and see how things shake out. And so we felt that by allowing the Billboard Exchange Program with all of the other options, with the bigger height, the changing the orientation, replacing the structure, that they were given some alternatives, and it didn't have to be digital right away, but knowing that over time, probably digital would be introduced to kind of juice the program again. And so that was one of the things. We also had complicated ownership patterns that have been since resolved. So we really are talking about one billboard company. There's one other billboard company in the city, but the one billboard company that's present owns about 90% of the stock. So that gives us actually an opportunity to think about how that operates in a different way than prior, because there was another person in the another company in the market, and it was going to become very complicated and possibly litigious. So we weren't ready to go there. But it was also really that new technology and wanting to see how it worked and how it would protect the community. So Kristen mentioned two different approaches. The upgrade eligibility zone, which currently exists, the upgrade eligibility zone is along the highways. And then the repositioning exchange really to provide more flexibility in the mixed-use commercial zone districts. And so really that eligibility or the repositioning exchange program is really viewed as a kind of a cap and trade, where we're not saying we're providing any new billboards anywhere, but it's how can we shift things around and be more nimble. Currently, it's based on a point structure, and so we're keeping the point structure for the upgrade eligibility zone. Again, that area along the freeway, they get so many points, and then they can use those points to buy their upgrades. And in the reposition areas, in the mixed-use commercial zone districts, we would actually use the actual square footage of the sign. So it's more flexible, and it has some variation to it. So in the upgrade eligibility zone, we've had research on the impacts. We've got them in the region all over the place. And state law has now kind of caught up and also regulates them, their operation, their separation distances between boards. The state reviews and licenses them. So, it's kind of covered in that regard. And so what we're proposing is really the only piece to this. There's a table. It's on page, if you're in your packets, find it. Page 120 of your packet, you can see the table. So the only change to the upgrade area that we're proposing is the digital sign face, and that no more than 10 digital billboards would be possible along the highways, and actually specified along 196 and 96, no more than 4 signs, 2 facing east, 2 facing west. Probably you'd see that means 1 sign on 196 going west, 1 sign going east if you're east of 131, and you'd likely see 1 going east, 1 going west on the other side of 131 and 196, and then no more than 6 signs on 131, 3 facing north, 3 facing south. So if you're thinking directions, right, so you would have 3 for the entire length of 131 within the city going northbound and 3 going southbound. To be able to install the digital billboard, it would cost them 2 credits for a new sign face for their new billboard. And it also would cost them to replace the structure, which has been a requirement already. So if they have to upgrade the structure to be able to hold a digital billboard, that would cost them an additional 3 credits. So by kind of naturally, we would see an additional reduction, could be up to 22 billboard faces through this by allowing those 10 digital boards in the city. Are there any questions on that before I go on? Just want to make sure everybody gets the math good and.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to
Yep,
wrap my
that's
head
fine.
around it all.
Yep.
So they couldn't just build 10 new digital billboards. They have to remove in order to build
Yes.
along. And do they have to remove them along, I'm sorry if you just said it, but do they have to remove them along 131 or 196, or they can remove them anywhere in the city and bank those, or use those credits here?
Correct. They can wherever, so right now the way it's currently written is billboards in the IT zone district where we allow billboards and the MCNC, those billboards do not count
Yeah.
towards the program because we're really trying to target downtown, near downtown and the TBA. So those are the credits. If they remove a billboard in one of those zone districts, those are the credits that would count and it could be used to upgrade to the digital.
Okay. So theoretically, we would see more billboards along those corridors
You will see no additional billboards. You would
along
just-
131 or 196?
Correct.
Okay, thank you, I'm sorry.
Yep, this isn't increasing the number at all. It's basically they would be taking down a static sign face that's currently there take that down, put up a digital. Yep.
One other question. Forgive me if you'll get to this, but what about timing? So there's a 3 years left on the lease, on Wealthy Street, and they want to use credits. Do they get, does that, obviously, is that less credit, worth less credits because there's little time left on the lease, or do they get a permanent replacement in exchange for what was a temporary sign?
Yeah, they just get the credit. We've gone through kind of, what if the billboard lease is up? Do they get a credit for that? How does that all work? It could get really complicated really fast, and those are private agreements. And so kind of from a policy perspective, we said if it's going down, the big thing is it's going down and we're getting development. When that happens, we don't really, when is the right time? Like, is it good if it's a year, if it's good if it's 10? Like, we didn't want to get into kind of what that duration was of the lease that was left, so just kept it simple, and, you get so many credits per face.
So if I have a billboard and my lease is expiring in 3 months, and I say, well, I'm going to transfer this lease to another face somewhere else, I essentially extend that billboard lease indefinitely then, potentially, right? Whereas it might be gone in 3 months.
You're saying if you're moving it to a different, that's the repositioning portion.
Okay.
So it's not for this program. So
Okay.
these upgrades are only for, you remove the billboard, you get the credits, and you can use it towards digital. So this one's just really clear.
Towards an upgrade, not a reposition or a new face somewhere else. Okay, gotcha.
Any questions? Okay. There is one other provision I just wanted to point out regarding digital, and that is they could do, instead of 2 sign removal credits, they could get a credit of 1 towards that if there's a voluntary public-private partnership approved by the City Commission that provides for emergency messaging, public safety initiatives, community outreach, and other benefits for public input. So if the billboard company wanted to voluntarily engage into an agreement with the city to basically sponsor or allow city messaging on their boards at no cost, then they would only have to have 1 credit to be able to switch the billboard face rather than 2. Okay, so the exchange program then, the exchange program is applicable to mixed-use commercial zone districts, follows that cap and trade methodology, so we're not allowing more signs, right? We're trying to be able to move the signs within those zone districts. So the square footage is really allowed to float within the zone district as development occurs. The logic in thinking about this was super interesting. This is the most interesting part for me. If you look at case law and if you look at tax law, so under tax law, billboards are considered personal fixtures. They're not considered trade fixtures. They're not considered kind of like property in that sense. So the lease agreement, it's like if I was a franchisee and I was leasing my Qdoba at the strip mall, and I'm going to move my Qdoba someplace else, I still have my Qdoba wherever it is, right? I've got my kitchen equipment I'm moving over. It's kind of the same thing. That's their trade fixtures, and you can move them. So billboards are specifically mentioned in tax law that they're trade fixtures. So this idea of floating them is basically taking their business model and allowing them to move within that particular zone district. So they are allowed to, in this case, a sign that is removed for redevelopment could be repositioned in another location without penalty, and that it would occur on walls, not with new billboard structures. So no new pole signs. You're basically allowed to pull the pole sign out. You can put it on a wall. You've got a lot of cases because of building code where you'll see a blank face of a building right at the property line. If the building is built to the property line, you can't have any window openings. And so you'll see blank walls. So that could be a temporary location for a billboard wall sign until the next development comes along next to it. So that's just an example of how that could work. And in actually both programs, I should have mentioned this before, if there is a project that the city feels very strongly about kind of getting things going on or getting things moved, they can get double credit. And that's been in existence already in the ordinance. So this is an example from out front. This is our west side, or I'm sorry, our Creston example. Whoops. So we have this sign that's across from Creston Brewing. And you could see on the library, if the library wanted to engage into a lease with the billboard company, that it would just go on the wall and the structure would be removed from that site. And all of this, it's the billboard company's responsibility to get a lease from the property owner. The city is not engaged in any of that. So if someone doesn't want a sign on their building, it doesn't happen. I mean, it's just a regular lease. Just again, like if I was going to open up and move my kitchen equipment in, that's kind of how it would work. Here's another example, and this is an example of kind of a supersized sign that was mentioned. You do see these in bigger cities where they're taking advantage of kind of these large blank areas to potentially think about how you could reposition. So in this case, if there is several billboards that were removed near the downtown area, that you could take that square footage, add it all up, and then put it onto a supersized sign in a certain location. In this case, for the supersized signs, they're proposed as special land uses, so you would see them before they would go in. So the billboard company would have to negotiate with the property owner, know what they're going to do, and then they would come in for planning commission review for this. So you could determine whether or not it was appropriate. And so we kind of did this cascade of what's allowed where, and kind of based on the aims that we have for facilitating redevelopment. So in the TBA zone district, you can only move a sign in the TBA. So I can't take sign square footage from the TCC zone district and put it into TBA. Okay, so, and the 253 square feet is the sign of a poster. So there's the small billboards and big billboards, and they're called a poster and a bulletin. So in this case, most of the signs that are in the neighborhood business districts are posters, and we're saying you can't have anything bigger than a poster size sign. But you could change again, if they're putting on a wall, it could be a different shape than our typical rectangle, but you can't be bigger than 253 square feet. In the CC and TCC zone districts, those super signs that I mentioned would be allowed, again, with Planning Commission special land use approval. Otherwise, if they're a poster or a bulletin, they could relocate, and they could relocate in the those two districts, but the originating zone districts would be the CC, TCC, or TBA. So they could take TBA credits and put them into the CC or TCC zone districts. MCNC, another mid-century neighborhood commercial district. So this is kind of your turn of the century business areas. Again, the same thing, kind of the structure again, CC, TCC, TBA, MCNC. Those credits originating there could be used in the MCNC zone district, and then all the above with TOD. So that was kind of the structure that we had, where we see the bigger signs in the MCNC district, and then we wanted the flexibility in the CC and TCC zone district to allow for those more unique sign arrangements. And that's pretty much, those are the big highlights for this. Trying to think if there's anything else that, nope, I think that's it. Oh, they also, if they're doing historic preservation, or if they're in the historic district, they would need HPC approval. And then one of the questions they had was whether or not digital should be planning director approval or special land use. And so we're hoping to get input from the Planning Commission on that. If you know where the number of signs are, you know the number of signs, you know where they're going to occur, whether or not that should be an administrative approval, or if it should be a special land use, or is there a hybrid if the concern is if it's visible for a residential property, does that trick off special land use, and otherwise if it's an industrial area and it's an upgrade, it's director approval. So we just wanted to get your input on that as well.
Yeah. Because I think a couple of the decisions we've talked about is the relocation is under staff review.
Yes.
Yep. The supersize, as it's currently written, would be a planning commission review. And again, we could break that out to say if it's sized up to X square feet, it's by right. If it's over that, it's planning commission. And then the digital billboards, like Suzanne just mentioned, would be planning commission review. I think traditionally, we've taken a cautious approach and included the public process, welcomed the public process that you have here to help inform those decisions. And as we better understand your pattern of decision-making and perhaps input from the community, we have made changes. Electronic message centers were one where it used to be all planning commission, and we started to see a pattern of approval, and we said, well, for all of those like circumstances, we'll keep it as a planning department decision. So there are ways to tease that out. Digital billboards, my preference is to keep it at a planning commission level. I'm open to the idea of if it's removed from residential uses. I really want to make sure we're cognizant of the historical impacts of the highway. And also, we know we have demographics of who lives along the highway, and I think it's really important that we consider that. So I'm a little bit hesitant on that. I'm open to, looking at the specific geographic location, but that's one of those decision points I'm a little less comfortable pulling it out of the Planning Commission decision-making.
Yeah, I have a question. So how many credits are currently banked? So like how many upgrades could happen without any additional billboards being removed?
My understanding is that there's 4 credits currently banked,
Okay. For total?
4 total by Outfront.
I would have to get back with you on that. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
And yeah, I agree with the digital sign billboards being special land use. I think we should see those.
I'm okay with that. I think we would need some pretty clear review standards for how to review that. Are there additional review standards besides just our SLU review standards that we're supposed to consider with that? Because otherwise, it's just how we feel about it.
Well, I think it's related to what Kristen said, right? Like the residents that are in the area, the opportunity for a public hearing about it, negative impacts on those neighborhoods, where the billboards currently are and where they're going to, are there more? I don't know. I want to look at the map again about where all the billboards are.
Do we have any information about what is the added impact of a digital versus a regular billboard on residents within certain areas? And coupled with that, I thought I heard you say that the digital billboards have to get a license or something from the state?
Correct.
Because it's on state right-of-way,
It's
maybe?
visible from the right-of-way.
So I wonder what their standards are as well.
Okay.
I'd also be curious, not necessarily with the upgrade of the existing signage, but if we're upgrading to a digital board, would we have design standards and material requirements for that? Just thinking about a new digital board along along 96, I-96, near the Walker exit. On the north side of 96, it's a stone base, basically. Like, it looks very nice. I don't know if that was a requirement of the industrial park there or the city, or if they just made the decision to spend extra money to make it look nicer, but I wonder if that's something that we could incorporate into this as well. And I know there was some discussion, I don't think you mentioned it, but the billboard companies wondering if they could receive credits for removing in the IT and how that works. If it's an allowable use right now? Could they just build new billboards in the industrial zone and then remove them in order to gain some credits? Okay, that's great. Let's not include that then.
You could change the separation distance requirement, which would then make it so they couldn't build new billboards. if it was
5,000 feet.
removed. Yes, yeah, you could. And Kristen and I did talk about that. And if you wanted to, I mean, but then, I mean, I think one of the challenges is one of the ideas behind it was trying to get it out of the way of development. And so it depends on what's happening in the industrial district. If you feel that it's in the way of development and you want billboards reduced there, that would, and then that would just apply.
It's
I think
not-
the suggestion would be that it would just apply to upgrades within the upgrade eligibility zone along the highway.
It seems like a bad faith argument to say that they should get the credits from removing something, building, then removing something in where it's already allowable, to put it in an area where it would be a special land use or otherwise not allowed. And also, I understand their perspective. I would guess that an industrial area is less desirable. It probably has less traffic than a commercial or a CC or TCC compared to the industrial. But it's also, there's a reason that it's allowable now, and it's because we don't care as much as we do in the TBA or CC or TCC.
The impact is less.
So we're crossing over where, of course, they want to remove them from in the industrial. They're not getting as much money for those boards, but the impact on the community is less when they're located in those areas. So I don't think it shouldn't be a one-for-one. They don't, in my opinion.
The way it's currently written does not allow for that. I know that might be a stated desire. I too have struggled with that. If the purpose of this is to incentivize and support development within our mixed commercial zone districts, then giving credit for the removal of billboards in the industrial districts or where they're otherwise permitted seems to undermine the purpose of the program itself. But it is something for consideration as well.
Can we go, the Creston example, right, that you had up there with the development where it potentially could move to the library? Is that is potentially a staff-approved, then, the relocation to the library? And it would be sort of done as part of the development application? Or is it a separate application for the library to put the billboard on their site?
Yep, so it would be a separate application for the billboard to be relocated from its current position to a future location. We would not integrate that with the actual development.
What's chicken and egg in that scenario? And I'm just curious more than anything, but.
Well, I think they could do either. They could run concurrent, which wouldn't be abnormal, especially if it's, if they're looking to receive double credit because of their willingness to move, to get out of the way, or that's probably a dramatic way, but to move to facilitate the redevelopment project. So it could be tied to a specific development, but it could just be other reasons to just desire to relocate it.
So I guess I'll go back to my question about timing again. If that company has a 2-year lease left on that parcel on Creston, and they just approach and say, hey, we'd like to relocate this to the library, that could be then a 20-year lease that they get in exchange for that. So in theory, they're just keeping their billboard in place where they would lose it otherwise. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. Yes.
So if I'm a billboard company, before they expire, I want to try to get a relocation quickly because I probably won't get a renewal on my lease.
But would that still be a net win?
I don't know, right? I mean,
Right.
That's the question is it, do I care if there's a permanent billboard on the side of a building? I guess the other question is, in the case that Suzanne brought up about it being on a lot line where there's not allowed to be windows, do they then require an easement next door to continue to maintain visibility, or could I build a building there a year later and block that billboard in perpetuity?
That's possible. I mean, that's all part of the private agreements between, of course, there's building code and such requirements, but that would all be part of the negotiation with the, I guess, the new property owner where it's being relocated to.
Yeah, so so that could be a challenge, right? For a billboard company to find a new place to put it that allows them to put it there and guarantees perpetual visibility by.
It would
having-
assume that the new person they're leasing from controls the property adjacent,
Well, I would think they'd want them to control it,
right?
right? If you don't control it, then in theory,
There's no
development could come along and
encumbrance, yeah.
yeah, and cover that.
I would say the value that a property owner gets from the billboard isn't, it's some revenue, but it's not substantial revenue from a rent standpoint. And based on what they've done, for example, they have kind of a similar program that they use in Detroit. And I think the idea is that they're understanding that the city's continually evolving and that, things are going to shift and change over time. And so if it's not on this building, it could be on a different building in the future that comes up. So I have not heard any concerns from the billboard company about, not being able to find locations in the future. I think the parking ramp example was a good one from being able to say, well, you're going to be probably seeing progressively larger buildings in this city, so there is opportunity.
Yeah, and we might see progressively larger billboards then, right? But potentially reduced numbers.
Could,
Yeah.
could.
It would seem to me might be helpful to understand the ways in which a billboard company can terminate, what are those conditions of their agreements to locate. And I've heard, I don't have any data in front of me, that those leases can be pretty good for the property owner in terms of dollars.
I think it depends on where the location,
Yeah,
right?
where
Number
the
of eyeballs
location
that are
is.
seeing it, yeah.
My son leases a property on 23 in Brighton, and he's been talking about buying it, and they have a billboard, and they want to keep the billboard, and so it must be pretty lucrative for whatever reason.
Yeah. I should have mentioned, and I apologize for forgetting to do so, that for the supersized billboards, there is a requirement because of the size of the sign, that it acknowledges that there could be potentially detrimental effects. And so in addition to it being special land use, there's also a requirement to contribute to an art fund as part of that to help pay for murals.
That would be for anything over that bill.
The
what was it?
678 square feet, whatever.
Yeah, the secondary size, whatever, the mid-size. Okay.
I think, though, to your point, this is super complicated. It's complicated currently. What attracts me to consider a change is that this gives us more tools. There's still challenges, but it at least gives us more tools than we have today to try to facilitate development.
Yeah, for sure, because I think to the point made earlier about, whether it's beneficial to the property, it's often very, very hard to get out of the leases as well, right? I mean, they're pretty ironclad, so.
Yep.
Yep.
And I think your timing question comes into play with the planning director's discretion on whether or not she's going to grant, you're getting the straight points versus double points. So if they're going to be done in if it's the wealthy property, they're done in 2 months, there's no incentive to say you're going to get double points. But if you're looking at 10 more years and something, all of a sudden this project comes out of the blue and this is in the center of it, then maybe it's worth it to offer the double points.
But is that public information?
Yeah, well.
You don't necessarily know how long the lease is because it's not an agreement with the city. The city's not granting that lease.
No,
It's
but
two private entities.
they'd be motivated to provide us with the details to inform that decision as to whether or not double points are warranted or not. So
Yeah, and there's actually criteria in the code to get the double points. They have to provide an imminent development project.
Yep. So it's very case or fact specific.
But how do you feel about having the pressure of having to figure that out and to figure out whether or not the library is a good location for it when you're getting pressure from a developer who's saying, listen, all you have to do is approve this on this building. I know you don't like it. Like, isn't it in some, how do you, I mean, that's where I feel like this body is, I don't know. I just would hate to see all that pressure on one individual to make that decision, regardless of who they are.
So that pressure exists today. And truthfully, it hasn't been terribly problematic because it is so case-specific, and we just evaluate the information. We work with the current property owner. We work with the billboard company, understanding their lease. We understand, what are the pressures on the private development group to advance their project, what funding, how is funding impacted. So all of that exists today. The only added layer of complexity is now where do they relocate to? But a lot of that is going to be private negotiations between the billboard company and the, I want to say the new property owner, the property owner of where it's relocated to.
So yeah, so I guess in the example on the screen, the library, like if you had to choose between the library and on the picture on the left, on the building that's higher than the dark brown building here, or the dark gray building, like what if it was going up there or up there? Like, how do you make that choice, or what is the staff evaluation going on in that case?
So I think we would accept either, and some of it would just be, which property owner is willing to allow for it. And I think the billboard company is, of course, going to have added criteria about visibility and guarantee that it will be visible longer. So what's happening adjacent in the picture on the left, I don't think the billboard company is going to want to put the board on that third story because the inherent property rights of the two adjacent properties and the pending redevelopment, it wouldn't make sense.
And in the library example, they say, well, that driveway is probably going to be there indefinitely, so.
Exactly.
And then what about, is it just sign standards? So if I wanted to put it on the third floor in the building on the left, but I want to project it 8 feet above the roof line, so it's a little bit higher, there's
No.
signs, is there sign standards that would kick into play then? It would just fall into that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I
And that
will say
was-
too that what's interesting is how much the technology has changed for billboards. So now they do clips and they do, they have the vinyls now instead of paper and all the boards. The wall attachments that they do are really a clip system that's really, it's not a major significant investment for them. So they are willing to, that's where they said there's no point in really doing pole signs anymore because of the technology that they can do wall signs. So that I think also helps with, it's not these permanent poles stuck in the ground, and we've got something else now we're dealing with a major investment on their behalf. It's just this clip system that works well, and it provides that flexibility.
I may have missed this and you may have reported it, but this is on existing freestanding billboards. How many new requests do we get and you get annually for billboards?
I can't think of the last time we received a request for a new billboard. Well,
That's because
no,
they're really not, there's really no place else for them to go. That's really.
That's a good thing.
They're either non-conforming, right? They're not, they're not allowed in that zone district, which is nearly every single zone district except for industrial. And then with the separation distances, they've filled all of the spots where you could have one. That's why you've got if you're down south of Burton, or is it Hall? There's this random billboard over by the rail yard that's way off, and you're like, what is that billboard doing there? That's because they met the separation requirements, and so that's where they could put it.
So we're at capacity for billboards.
So yeah, following up on Erin's point in terms of the projecting and there are, regardless of the type of review they'd get, whether planning commission or director review, there are specific placement standards they have to meet, correct?
there are some placement standards, yes.
Okay.
Like you can't project a sign, period, above a roof of a building.
Okay.
You also can't, in here, it's also written you can't cover doors and windows.
Okay, great. All right, thanks.
All right, any other discussion on the presentation today? Any other feedback before this comes back to us in the future? Okay.
So I heard some follow-up questions. How many credits are currently banked? You'd like us to confirm that and confirm the number 4. And making sure we understand the review standards for digital billboards and whether they're adequate. Looking at whether we should be considering bringing forth some design standards for consideration. And then see if we have data on impact of digital billboards on residents.
And I think the state also has control over that, and it'd be interesting to see what their standards are.
The state of Michigan requirements.
I would add that on the digital, it would be interesting to understand, and I'm sure there's science and stuff behind this, but like a digital billboard projects some light, but a non-digital billboard is also lit and generally provides light pollution also. So is there a dramatic difference and I don't know how to quantify that.
Well, that may be a subjective question, but yes, the billboard companies can provide us with how much light is casted from the billboard and show us physically where that lands.
And there is a light requirement in here, and it's based off the state of Michigan requirement. So it aligns with the state of Michigan requirement. I think it's 0.03 lumens or something like that. So I'd have to find it, but it is in there. They also have added, with the technology, they've added louvers to them, so the visibility, like you can't see like right off the side, so the brightness doesn't catch your eye now. It's like if you're looking directly on the sign, then you can see it, but otherwise it's kind of like those shades where you can only see it in certain directions. And so they've done louvers on both directions to try to limit the amount of spread.
Is the general, I mean, maybe summarize, what is the general, what's the general distaste around digital billboards? What would be the general argument against them versus a static billboard?
Driving distraction.
It's more, well, partly it's aesthetics, just kind of, I think, personal preference, but then also the concern about distraction has been there. I think, and that's one of the reasons why when digital first came out, we wanted to wait because we're like, let's see what Federal Highway says and let's see what the safety studies show. And there's been really nothing that has been, I mean, part of it, if you look for the studies, part of it is the studies are by industry, right? Which is why we wanted to wait for Federal Highway. Federal Highway hasn't really come out. I mean, they have timing standards, and the standards that MDOT uses now regarding light levels all kind of come from those pieces. But other than that, they've never come out and declared it a distraction and a driver hazard or anything else. So there's nothing to kind of go back to from that standpoint and say, right here, we wouldn't allow it because of the distraction piece. It's been one of those areas that people have contested they've contested in court. And so it's just, I think the technology now has gotten so good that it's less of a distraction and less of a hazard. I think it's more of a visual aesthetic thing at this point.
When I hear us talking about it from a residential standpoint, then I'm hearing it's largely just, it's catching my eye because it's changing, and I'd rather have something static off in the distance than.
Yeah, and they change every 8 seconds, 6 to 8 seconds. So that switch. It's like that Jerry Seinfeld, the episode with the blinking sign, right? It's not quite that bad, but there are provisions in here about, it has to change instantaneously. So it's not like this scrolling or sprinkling or anything that happens. It has to be instant. It has to be a certain light level. If there's anything that happens with the sign where it starts to not work, it automatically has to shut off. So there's some of those
There's not
provisions that
movement
wouldn't
on
distract.
it, things like that. Yeah.
I think that the potential impact to residents, though. Our highway is far closer to our residential neighborhoods than it is in the Walker example. And I don't think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And so we can control for the brightness and the timing, but if you're living next to that highway and next to that billboard, you know, your windows are now lit up. And so I think we need to understand that.
For sure, and I thought that's what and my initial question was, are they really lit up more than a static billboard that has floodlights on it? And I'm not hearing that, but again, I don't know the science behind it, but I'd love to see more about that.
They have a lighting specialist that we can have provide comment on that.
Could we also in the next packet or whenever have that map included about where the billboards are, or if that data is available for us?
Yep.
I'd like to look at that deeper.
Sure.
Thanks.
The first go around when the Billboard Exchange Program was created, all the billboard companies shared with the city their data about their signs. Each sign has their own ID number, so if you look at it and you see a little number like a license plate, that's their licensing sign from the state, their number, and so we've got that all corresponded with size of sign, location, which way they face, all of that. Yeah, there's a whole inventory, so we can provide that.
We're having a fun argument about design standards.
All right, any other discussion on this? All right, then we'll put a pin in this one until it comes to us.
Yep, it'll come to you at the first meeting in June, is scheduled for the public hearing on this. So if there is any feedback between now and then that you think of, please feel free to email me and I will share that with Suzanne. We will work to provide answers to you on these, or provide information and bring that to you in June as well.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Suzanne. I'll open up the public comment portion of the meeting. If you're here today and have anything to share with us, please come forward, state your name, and share your thoughts. All right, I'll close public comment. Anything else, commissioners or staff? All right, then we're adjourned.